all here this morning to hear Erik Larson. Erik is the author of 8 books, including the bestsellers The Splendid and the Vile, The Devil in the White City, In the Garden of Beasts, and Isaac's Storm. His newest narrative nonfiction, The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War, was published in April. He'll be in conversation with Linda Henry. Linda Henry serves as the Chief Executive Officer and co-owner of Boston Globe Media, a dynamic and modern multimedia organization that includes the Boston Globe, Boston.com, Stat News, and the Harvard Bookstore. She's a 4-time Emmy Award-winning television producer and Emmy-nominated documentary producer and children's book author. Please join me in welcoming Erik Larson and Linda Henry.
Hello, hello. This is so beautiful to see, 9 a.m. on a Friday morning, and we have a packed house here to talk about the Civil War. This is extraordinary. I want to start by just saying thank you to the Nantucket Book Foundation. I see Jill Karp sitting here. It is a labor of love and such an important thing to be gathering and convening and supporting the incredibly rich literary community that we have here on Nantucket. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you to those who supported it, and welcome.
Can I say one thing? Thank you, Linda. I feel like I should be interviewing you, but.
So just to start, I read about this really well-respected, best-selling author, historian, who said that he would never write a book about the Civil War. And then he went on to write this book that just changed all of our understanding of what brought us to that point of a country sort of dividing and turning on itself. So how did that brilliant historian come to change his mind?
Who was that? So, God, with a lead in like that, I don't know what to say. But, you know, I did, in fact, vow, and you can Google this, at least half a dozen times over the last decade, that I would never, never, ever write about the Civil War, and never, ever, ever, ever write about anything that had to do with Abraham Lincoln. Because I think Abraham Lincoln, somebody told me that Lincoln has had something like 16,000 books written about him. And what am I going to do? What am I going to add to the program? But what happened with this was, this goes back to, sadly, I hate to bring this up, but the pandemic. I was in the midst of a book tour for my book, The Splendid and the Vile, about Winston Churchill. Halfway through the tour, the world shut down. I was on my way home, actually on my wife's birthday, arrived at what became our pandemic fortress. I had a lot of time on my hands. And I just thought, okay, I'm going to look for my next book. And I had some fairly lame ideas that I was exploring. But you know, if you recall back then, as now, unfortunately, there was a good deal of political discord in America. There was you know, talk from fringe groups and not so fringe groups of secession and civil war. Secession, you know, Texas was talking about it, and that was, my attitude is go ahead. But luckily, that was not Lincoln's attitude, by the way, back in the day. So I started thinking about, you know, with all this talk of secession and a contemporary Civil War, I just, for whatever reason, I started thinking, well, what caused the American Civil War really? What led up to the start of the war? You know, the bombardment of Fort Sumter. How did that happen? So I went online. Usually, my usual MO would have been to jump into a physical archive and just without any pre-planning and just see what was available, see what kind of depth of primary materials were accessible. Couldn't do that because of the pandemic. Archives were closed and I wouldn't want to fly to them anyway. But I came across this trove of records online called The War of the Rebellion, the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. I got a physical volume of that collection. The collection goes up to 100 volumes. I got volume 1 for obvious reasons. Volume 1 arrives at my pandemic readout. Of course, I literally disinfected it first. You know, that was the advice at the time. we were all doing that. You know, And I started reading this collection, and I was absolutely enthralled. Here was this, I don't know how many, hundreds of documents, wonderfully curated in precise chronological order, so that you had a letter and a response, a telegram, a response, a report, a response, and so forth, all tracking this inexorable drive toward America's greatest tragedy. And so I started thinking, wait a minute, this is a story that I certainly did not know. And I'm not a Civil War expert. I came to this with, the standard, high school timeline knowledge of the Civil War. But I was enthralled. I mean, it just gave such an insight into the tick-tock of this thing. And as I read it, I found myself feeling the way I felt when I read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August about the start of World War I, which is, how can these people let this thing happen? Why is this happening? Why are we getting to this point? And so that was the germ of the story, and that's when I started becoming interested in doing it. That's not when I committed to it.
Your pandemic was a lot more productive than my pandemic. That's really, really impressive.
The fact is, my pandemic was actually quite, I don't want to say pleasant, it was scary as hell, but lockdown is what we writers do. I mean, if anybody's a writer out there, you know what I mean. Okay, I got to stay in my room and write all day? Okay.
And so you had not committed to writing. You had this incredible amount of research, and I think that available to you from home, which was, a beautiful organization of accessibility for you. But you were going through and you were reading this, but you had not yet committed. What got you to commit?
Yeah, so I was basically, in a fairly desultory way, reading about the Civil War, reading about still some of these other ideas, and then came the events of January 6, 2021. And I followed that, and I just watched that whole thing all day long, all evening long, with just this sort of sense of anxiety and fear, but also I was riveted. I was riveted, and I thought to myself, this must be how people felt back in 1860-61 when the nation was about to fall apart. And so maybe maybe I could somehow try to capture that kind of feeling back in 1860-61. And also I found that there were weird parallels. Like in 1861, the two moments of gravest national concern prior to the start of the Civil War were, would the electoral count come off, and would the inauguration come off? And doesn't that sound familiar? However, back in the day, happily, there was a fellow named General Winfield Scott, America's foremost military hero. He was in his waning days of his career, 6'4", 350 pounds, ailing, kept his feet in an ice bath every day. But militarily, he still had a lot of savvy. And he committed privately and publicly. He said, these two events will come off without disruption, and he made sure that was going to happen, unlike what happened, of course, in 2021. But he filled Washington with soldiers, cavalry, even cannon, and threatened to blow anybody who tried to interfere with the count into smithereens, and it's something to the effect to mulch the Virginia hills with their remains of their bodies.
Beautifully evocative, actually. So once the pandemic was cleared up, you were able to travel and do the type of research that you typically do, and that took you to the exotic location of South Carolina.
Right.
How did this state, which was not an economic, it was a state in decline, It was not very populated, how did this become sort of the fulcrum? Well,
it is an enduring mystery to some extent, and I still find myself somewhat perplexed, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that South Carolina had a long history of being this really persnickety state, rebellious on all things, and in fact was considered by other southern states to be something of an embarrassment. They did not want South Carolina to be leading the secession thing because everybody would dismiss it as, it's just South Carolina being South Carolina.
I feel like in Massachusetts, it's like New Jersey.
You said that. but South Carolina had always been that way. And the political structure was such that the planter aristocracy, which one historian very I think quite nicely phrased as the slavocracy, the planter aristocracy, the planters held all the power in South Carolina. The political structure was rigged so that would in fact be the case. And these, of course, were the major slave owners. And what happened is when Lincoln was elected, the South, we talked today about people living in an echo chamber where they just, all they hear is their own views and don't think about other views. The problem was in the South, when Lincoln was elected in 1860, the South, especially South Carolinians, persuaded themselves that Lincoln was the Antichrist, that his one goal was to abolish slavery. And to Southerners, and this is something that Lincoln did not appreciate, at least not at first, to Southerners, the idea of abolishing slavery was an existential threat, because their entire culture, the society that allowed them to do all these beautiful things and to dress up like knights, which they literally did, and call themselves the chivalry, was all based on the enslavement of blacks. If that went away, Southern culture would collapse. And also because in a very material way, and this is something that I think people sometimes forget, is that the enslaved, more than simply being labor, were capital. They were capital. They had a value. A prime #1 male black field worker was valued at $1,500 in 1860 value. That's a lot of money today. More than that, you could get a mortgage secured by your enslaved workers, or you could buy land secured by your enslaved workers. And this was not just the Southern thing. There were New York firms that were providing the financial infrastructure to do this very thing. Anyway, I'm rambling on there, but that's basically how it happened.
So I've done this trip to South Carolina, and it's no Nantucket, but it's very beautiful. And it is, the Civil War is still very much alive there in such an interesting way. The offices for the Boston Globe are in downtown Boston on the Freedom Trail, and so I see somebody dressed like Paul Revere and Benjamin Franklin wandering around there, leading groups of people through the Revolutionary War. So to me, and so for people in New England, that's sort of a very, very present thing. And in South Carolina, the Civil War is still very much part of their current.
Yeah, the War of Northern Aggression.
Yes.
Is what it's called. It actually is very much alive. I did with some trepidation, I did a very big event down in Charleston for this book, and I had no idea what to expect. I was sort of vaguely curious to know if tar and feathering was still something they did down in South Carolina. But happily, I mean, the reception was fantastic, so pleasant. But during the signing, I had people coming up to me. It was one woman in particular who said, my great-great-great-grandfather signed the Ordinance of Secession that allowed South Carolina to secede from the Union. And she said this with great pride.
Yeah, I maybe wouldn't have mentioned that one.
And somebody else wanted me to inscribe her book to such and such general, who was one of the Confederacy's most notorious generals. And I was like, I'm just going to say hi for so.
Another great organization, and there are many great organizations in Nantucket in addition to the Nantucket Book Foundation. I went and visited with the Nantucket Historical Association, and was really impressed to see how much the Civil War was a part of Nantucket. And so I wrote down some facts. So we have just right around the corner from here, we have an incredible Civil War obelisk monument in that rotary, and on it is inscribed the names of the 73 Nantucket people who died in the Civil War. So Nantucket sent 339 people, which was 56 over the town quota. And in 1875, that Soldiers and Sailors Monument was dedicated. And this was, in Nantucket, this was a really big deal. It was the first which the Nantucket community had participated because of the Quaker pacifism had kept them out of the war. And so the Civil War impacted this small island and had a really big impact on its future, because all of the whaling vessels were sort of put in to be war vessels, and sort of a lot of the whaling industry had already moved to New Bedford, but what was left of it was there. Those ships are now somewhere near South Carolina.
Presumably they were fighting on the northern side.
They were, actually.
Just wanted to confirm that.
They were in the north. So it's an interesting. Your research didn't take you to Nantucket, but there is a really big impact there. And so in this book, which you're all going to read, and you have to read to get all of the incredible details that are in there.
You have to read it because there's going to be a quiz online, and you can use AI to cheat if you want.
But you go a lot into, back to your trip to South Carolina, is Fort Sumter, and how that was really where things started. So if you don't mind talking to us about how this small fort.
Yeah. So first of all, anybody who goes to to Charleston, Fort Sumter today is. I was so disappointed going out to Fort Sumter because I still expected this looming sea fortress that existed back in 1860 when Fort Sumter had 50-foot walls and was designed to be virtually impregnable against foreign attack, against the attacks by France, Spain, and England, who were at that time still considered to be the major threats to America. It was not built to defend against fellow Americans attacking from behind. But so here's this sea fortress in Charleston Harbor, surrounded by water, started in 1828. Construction, things don't really change that much. Construction was still underway in 1860. It was far from done. The fortress, the walls were up. Many of the structures inside were up. The officers' quarters were ready. The guns were not in place. They were lying around on the parade ground within the fort. But what's important about this Charleston Bay at this time is that Fort Sumter was, and it's not Sumter. Lincoln could not get that straight, by the way. It was always for him Sumter. He also could not spell inauguration. This is something that I found very endearing. I mean, he could not spell inauguration. But it's important to know that there was a Fort Sumter, the most rigorous and still very much largely impregnable from the sea fortress was Fort Moultrie, which is on Sullivan's Island off Charleston. There's also something called Castle Pinckney. There was a Fort Johnson, the former Revolutionary War fort, and there was also an arsenal. So in early November, earlier than Lincoln's election on November 6th, a gentleman named Robert Anderson, Major Robert Anderson, was placed in charge of federal operations in Charleston Harbor. What's interesting about Anderson, well, many things are interesting about Anderson, but one was that he was a Southerner. He was from Kentucky. He and his wife were former slave owners. She came from a big Georgia planting family. So this guy is put in charge of these federal facilities. One theory, there's speculation that he was placed in charge because he would be more likely to surrender those facilities when things started getting more intense. But this was a complete misreading of Major Robert Anderson, who was absolutely loyal, not so much to the United States, but to the United States Army. And he was unshakable in that loyalty. And as things started getting really intense in Charleston Harbor after Lincoln's election, and especially after South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, he realized, he was a former West Point artillery instructor, he realized that the fort that he was occupying as his headquarters, Fort Moultrie, was indefensible, and with good reason. Once again, this was built to defend against attack from the sea, not from behind. This fort had been allowed to sort of languish to the point where sand was drifting up against the rear ramparts to the extent that occasionally a cow would wander into the fortress. So this is not a defensible place. And Anderson recognized this in a way that his superiors in Washington, who left him completely on his own, in a way that his superiors did not recognize. He understood this, and as things became even more intense after the December 20th secession, he realized that the attack was very likely imminent, and he cooked up this secret plan he kept even secret from his officers, to move his forces from Moultrie to Fort Sumter under cover of darkness. Another point necessary to know is that Fort Sumter was designed to have 650 regular Army soldiers staffing it. Anderson had 75 men at his disposal. So Anderson cooks up this plan. He's gonna move these people, everybody, after dark on Christmas night, because everybody's gonna be distracted by the holiday, and this is a good time to do that kind of thing. Couldn't do it. Weather was too bad. Does it the next night. Pulls it off with such brilliance that even his Confederate opponents at a private meeting they held praised him, something that he in turn informed the War Department in Washington that he was so pleased to hear that his Southern opponents had approved of his move to Fort Sumter. But anyway, that was the setup, and then things degraded from there.
So you talked about how there were incredible, there's just an exhaustive library about Lincoln. There's less exhaustive library about Buchanan's leadership. Which your book sort of illustrates.
Or lack thereof.
Yeah. Your book illustrates why, and I think that your positioning of that framing of that was really helpful for my understanding, because Buchanan was president during this time.
Well, he was president in name only. Buchanan was a disappointment as a president. This was a surprise to many, because prior to becoming president, he had such a stellar political. Thank you. He had such a. That was my dad. He had such a stellar political career. Every electoral position that he ran for, leading up to finally the biggest being the presidency, he won with absolutely not even breaking a sweat, and he did a really great job at those things. He was not equipped to deal with the potential collapse of the United States. Far from it. He himself was very sympathetic to the South. His cabinet, his war secretary. Everybody, not everybody, but many of them actually eventually fled to join the Confederacy. It was that kind of a situation. But he was inept. He was passive. The New York Times complained that now we have to deal with, toward the end, now we have to deal with 3 more months of this imbecility before Lincoln took office. The problem there is that he was so passive. His penultimate speech to Congress, very important speech, he literally gave up. He literally gave up. He said, I can't do anything. I can't resolve this situation. It's up to Congress. And we know how effective Congress is. And the same situation existed then, only worse.
Only they had knives.
Oh, yeah. Back in one of the characters in the book notes that at one point everybody in Congress was carrying a pistol, and anybody who wasn't carrying a pistol was carrying 2. Buchanan, all he wanted toward the end here, all he wanted was to get out of office without war starting on his time. And he was doing everything he could to possibly make sure that would not happen. All he wanted to do was get back to his family estate outside. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. I always say Lancaster, but it's not. It's Lancaster. Lancaster, right?
You lived in Pennsylvania.
I lived in Philly. So here's this vacuum in the presidency. But on the other side, there's Abraham Lincoln, elected November 6th. He's enough of a lawyer, enough of a respecter of the Constitution to recognize that he is not actually yet really the President of the United States. First has to come the electoral count, then has to come the inauguration. Because of the intensity of the conflict in America at this time, he decides that he is going to stay silent, or at least as silent as he felt he could. He still planted his views through friendly politicians and newspaper editors and so forth, but he himself decided to keep silent. So what you have is a situation where there is a vacuum, and Anderson is not even getting direction from Buchanan or the War Department, and things are getting more and more heated in Charleston Harbor, with the outcome being virtually inevitable.
I'm going to open it up to questions from this incredible audience in a few minutes, but while they're getting the microphones ready, I want to talk about the title. the demon of unrest that came from this really great quote that there was a demon loose in the land. Can you sort of expound upon that and sort of that eureka moment you had?
Yeah. One of my secondary characters, and when I say character, I mean these are actual historical actors. I just character
but
is
they
easier
are
to
also
say.
characters.
They are characters. Yeah, there are two great villains in this too, by the way. But one gentleman wrote in a letter, he complained about how the demon of unrest was loose in the country, and I loved that. Immediately it became my title. I had to be somewhat persuasive with my editor, but that was my title because it's so apt. The concept of this some kind of demon afoot in the land, stirring up trouble, kind of like there is today. There's this demon out there, making people angry and getting everybody upset and so forth. So that's why that became my title.
I heard you talk about accelerationists today and what they're called, and how you're sort of connecting that to some of the forces that were in play back then.
Well, I'm by accelerationists. I've been asked periodically, what I think about parallels between then and today. And one of the first things I have to say is that I vowed as a New Year's resolution never to talk politics with anyone over the age of 5. So, having said that, if we can all for a moment revert. We all revert to kindergarten. The interesting thing is, people have asked me, well, do I think that there's the potential for another civil war today? And I don't, at least not a civil war that looks anything like what happened back in 1860-61, because back then there was this fundamental issue, this discordance between North and South, and that was slavery. And make no mistake about it, it was about slavery, not about states' rights. It was about slavery. It comes very clear when you read the documents of the past. But what is of concern is this: there is this sort of sense of sort of seething potential for violence. And frankly, I look around and I don't get it. I don't know why everybody's being so nasty to each other. I just wish we just give it up, and just for once, sort of recognize that there is no real conflict going on. I mean, this is also what Buchanan pointed out back in 1861. He said, look. He said, I don't get it. He said, the nation is in a period of unprecedented prosperity, and he cited all these blah, blah, blah. What is the problem? And so that's my attitude too. But the FBI, Homeland Security, and so forth, they look around the situation today, and they're more worried. They're worried not so much about civil war, but they are worried about kind of one-off violence. And there's a particular group of people who are referred to accelerationists. These are people who the FBI and Homeland Security fear have the potential to do violent acts that will destabilize society, in the delusive belief that this will accelerate the advent of some better political world. It's unclear what world that is, but that's what the fear is.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're optimistic about our country's future.
I didn't say that.
I'm going to take that as optimism. Who has the microphones? Who is there a person with a microphone?
And if you don't have a mic, just shout out a question.
You have a microphone. All right, we have someone over here. Do you want to get right here? This gentleman in front. I know Mark over here has a question as well.
Thank you for all that you've given us in terms of entertainment and wisdom and movie rights. Every time I read your books, I think they read like a screenplay. But I'm surprised they haven't seen any movies.
Yeah, so am I.
Do you know anyone? I feel like there are people here.
So you're touching a mildly sore point. Take Devil in the White City. Devil in the White City has been under option by heavyweight producers and directors from day one. And that book, I hate to say it, came out in 2003. Oh. I have people who come up to me routinely, adults of a certain age, who say, I studied that book in high school. But it's been under option forever. I have 6 other books under option with very interesting people. Tom Hanks with In the Garden of the Beasts, and Disney with something else. And my usual attitude is that I don't want to get involved. I take Tom Wolfe's approach. He once said, when you're dealing with Hollywood, you take your book to the fence, hand it over, take the bag of money, and run. And that's always been my attitude until I allowed myself, just actually within the last few months, I allowed myself to finally believe, because Keanu Reeves had signed on to be Burnham in Devil in the White City. I don't really see him. Well, wait a minute. There's another shoe here. It's about to drop. So Keanu Reeves had signed on. Not only signed on, he had signed a compensation package, and that's like, okay, that's good. And the director had chosen was going to be David McKay, who did that film Don't Look Up, and then also the one with Cate Blanchett, the cellist. And so things were starting to look really good, so much so that I felt I needed to reward my first, not reward, but honor my first Hollywood agent, who had negotiated the initial deal way back in 2003. And so I actually sent her a bottle of champagne, a $360 bottle of champagne. That's how confident I was that this was going to happen. 3 days later, I get a call from my agent on a Friday evening. Keanu's out. The director's out. And I was like, I was really depressed. My wife, who is in the audience, will attest to that. I was like, what? But then the next day, I'm a big fan of Hemingway and his Nick Adams stories. It's like, it was noon the next day before I realized that my heart was broken. So, oh no, there's nothing to be sad about.
I also like Keanu Reeves, so I understand.
The very positive side of the whole Devil in the White City saga, the repeated options and purchases and renewals and so forth, is that it put my kids through college. I mean, it really did. It really did. So I'm grateful for everything, but I sure wish one would get made.
Mark, thank you for volunteering.
Oh, thank you. Erik, I've read most of your books, and I love them. And they show the complexity of history and how what we think might have happened is quite different than what really happened. And my question is to you, and even to you, Linda, we live in a time of historical amnesia, where most Americans have no idea what came before or have context. And it's a soundbite society, which is the opposite of the truth, which is the complexity of what has happened. How can you both help deal with this, what I think is a crisis in America, where there's no context for why things are happening, and through the stories that you tell, for those of us who are fortunate to read them, it really helps us to understand what's beneath the surface.
Well, I can't speak for Linda, but, hey, I wrote the book. So, no, I mean, I do agree with it. There is a significant degree of historical amnesia, and to some extent, it's voluntary amnesia. But you do what you can. I write books, and hopefully people derive something from that. Now, Linda probably has much more potential impact than I.
So Mark owns the beautiful Hotel Nantucket, and we saw him last night. Thank you for hosting the authors last night.
Yeah, the bar makes good martinis.
I'm very lucky that I work at an institution whose job is to keep people informed, and so I think that there is a balance of what we do doesn't have sort of the time and space to do what you do. Which you used to do what we do, and you lived that life as a journalist for a long time, and then to sort of take this depth and perspective of time is definitely, I think both of us have things that help that situation, Mark, between the newspaper and books.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Hopefully. There's some other questions with wherever we can reach. Thank you. Thanks.
I'd just like to thank you so much, firstly, because my husband listened to your book, and he has a whole new appreciation of the horrors of slavery and its primary cause as the Civil War, for the Civil War. So, bravo.
Thank you.
Secondly, did you discover the way I did that there are these minor characters like Hammond and Mary Chestnut, whom you didn't know very much about, but you've brought them to life in a wonderful way. I think of, the Andersons in that war, but I also will never forget Hammond or Mary Chestnut and her flirtation with Manning. Just so many wonderful anecdotes
great.
in it.
Mary
So I'd
Chestnut.
love to know if you discovered them the same way you made me discover them.
Yeah, because I was a complete neophyte when it came to the Civil War. I really did not know much at all, and that was sort of basically my superpower was ignorance. And I mean that in a literal way. You come to something fresh. I mean, I read books about the Civil War. I read books about Lincoln, but my expertise was quite thin. But that's I found time and time again with my books that's actually something of value, because you approach things without the orthodoxy of Lincoln historiography weighting you down. And so yes, like when I came across Senator James Henry Hammond, who's one of two villains in my book, I was just absolutely captivated, and I realized, yes, this guy is going to be in my book for a very specific strategic reason. When you write about this period, you can say you're going to start this thing on November 6, 1860, with the election of Lincoln, but the problem is there's a lot of backstory. And you can tell that backstory two ways. One, in a very sort of monographic, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and by page 10, the entire audience would have gone on to the Thursday Murder Club books, which I adore, by the way. But I realized that you can also tell this backstory through prime characters who lived the backstory and talk about how that affected them. For example, the advent of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we all know and have heard of. But one thing that I was very impressed by was how tectonic a shock that book was to both Northerners and Southerners. And I tell about that through one of the characters. And also John Brown's raid through another character, Edmund Ruffin, who is my all-time favorite villain. And then Mary Chestnut, Mary Chestnut was the preeminent female diarist of the Civil War era. Typically, historians of the Civil War have used her as kind of a Greek chorus. They will quote her on something that is unfolding, but not necessarily portray her. And I loved her diaries so much. I mean, anybody who calls a fellow society matron a miscreant is going to be in my book no matter what, And so I felt she should step forward as a character in and of her own right to tell us about the South, tell us about Southern culture, the social whirlwind in Charleston of paying calls and return calls and riding around the Esplanade on carriages and all this stuff as the world was going to hell was very valuable to me. And she has you mentioned, I love that flirtation. I love that flirtation. You'd have to read the book to understand what that's about, but that doubly confirmed that this woman is going to be in my book. But the secondary characters, to me, are very, very much primary characters, and they serve that very, very important purpose of telling us how we got to this state, and then we carry those characters forward. James Hammond, I won't tell you all of his villainous deeds, but at one point, and he confesses this in his diary, a very detailed diary. He confesses that at one point he had a sexual dalliance with 4 of his nieces at once. And I know that's the standard reaction is, ew, Yeah, but he confesses this, and he also applauds himself in this diary for restraining himself from going further. That he deserves credit for this. Anyway, he's a great villain. Thank you for pointing that out.
As the microphone is making its way over, I've talked to other historians who have said how badly they feel for future historians because the treasure of written documents that you have, that you got sort of bound up and handed you, the spine of your book, as you've called it, and sort of what we do today, where we don't have the same letter correspondence and physical records. It's way much harder.
Poor babies, they won't have it. No, I am very optimistic on that score, actually, because I use letters, I use memoirs, I use diaries because they're available, and in the 19th century was the heyday of detailed diaries and letters, and actually the heyday really extended up into, say, around 1950, with the added benefit of from 1900 to 1950, people typed, and you have no idea how good that is, because when you have to read endless letters with people who were accustomed to reading handwriting, but today we see these things, it's like, oh my God, there was a practice back in the day of writing a letter and then to stay stationary, writing another letter sideways over that letter. And people were familiar enough with handwriting in that age to be able to interpret and read this. And the funny thing today is a weird little anecdote. I was talking to an archivist at the Charleston Historical Society, and she said they were trying to hire a new archivist. And they were on the verge of hiring this person until they realized she did not know how to write a script. She didn't know how to write longhand. And could therefore not read longhand. And how do you do that if you're going to be reading? But I'm very optimistic because there are other things that historians will use. The National Archives, for example, is stockpiling huge troves of tweets. It's going to be ugly for those poor historians to wade through these tweets. Maybe there'll be a search function, whatever. AI will come into play. But so I'm optimistic, and there are still written records. The United States government is actually very good about tracking and chronicling and keeping track in the archives. So I'm not down about that process.
Okay, I'm getting a this symbol, and then I said, but somebody has a microphone over here.
One more question.
So we can do one quick question.
Okay, quick question. I'm almost finished with the book, and it's wonderful, as are all of your books. And
wait, what'd you say?
all of your books are wonderful and should be made into movies.
Yes.
Whoever can influence that. Thunderstruck would be an amazing movie. Anyway, my question is, and it's a little bit of a follow-up to the prior question, your secondary characters in Mary Chestnut, but specifically, given that women of the time didn't vote or hold office or were in the military, they seem to have tremendous influence on the men in their orbits, and I wonder if that surprised you, or if there were little nuggets that you found that you were like, wow, women really did have an outsized influence, or if that was just my reading of it. Thank you.
No, it's very true, and especially that you can see that very clearly through Mary Chestnut and her relationship with her husband, Senator James Chestnut. I tell you, that's a marriage worth studying. She was really sort of down on her husband and just making all these sort of snippy remarks and wanted him to. At one point, he resigned from the U.S. Senate in sympathy with the secessionists, and she writes in her diary, she says, I told him not to. I wish he had not done so, And so, she had a lot of influence. She would write about her female peers, again, in very, very objective terms.
Like you just wanted to drink tea while listening to
I wanted to drink bourbon with these women. But yeah, so they did. They had a very interesting, subtle backroom influence over their husbands.
I got the symbol again. So I want to start by thanking you, Mr. Larson. This has been a phenomenal conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. This has been a lot of fun. I am so impressed and so grateful to be part of this beautiful community here on Nantucket that will turn up and shares in this curiosity. Reading can be a solitary act, and to come out and share it with your neighbors and friends here is a really wonderful thing. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to Tim and to Jill and everybody here from the Nantucket Book Foundation. You are giving us a wonderful gift. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Linda.